Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim, this is Dr. K, and as we continue our talk about the Macdonald era, we won't be talking about Macdonald himself, we'll be talking about Mackenzie, another Mac. So does he continue with the national dream?
Yeah, so we've talked about his moral reforms, right, the booze, and we've talked about the other stuff, but I did say to you that he was forced to kind of continue the railway policy. He's not really keen on it, but he's forced to continue it. So he believed that the railway should follow settlement, not precede it. Macdonald, of course, thought the railway should get slapped out there and then all the people build it and they will come, right? Yeah. So Mackenzie is influenced by the start of the credit squeeze, and the credit squeeze turns into a worldwide recession really from the day he comes to power, from the 1874, and it lasts almost until 1896. So the world's in kind of rough shape then. And he'd come to power promising frugal government, fiscal reforms. We won't spend more than we take in, and that was what he wanted to deliver, not some madcap, expensive national dream, let's build railways everywhere kind of thing. And so because of economic concerns, he didn't mind. He actually looked at the American model, and he said he wouldn't mind if the route went south of the Great Lakes, and he thought that the railway should just be part of a transportation system. They should have the steamship as they had before the steamship where necessary, and then, you know, a road at one point and train at other points. So here Macdonald's idea of having the one railway all the way across, Mackenzie's like, you know, that's going to cost a lot of money and it's not really necessary. And if you looked at what the Americans were doing, you could have followed their kind of system. So water navigation, roads, trains. And he also believed that the government shouldn't have to live up to its 10-year promise to BC. And so at that point, the Governor-General jumped in and said, hey, that's part of the Confederation deal. Got to have it within 10 years, so I don't care what it takes. You're going to have to do it. So it's difficult. He's in a difficult position. That's why I say, like, he doesn't get as much... you know, they don't kind of, he's not feted the way Macdonald is. So he actually starts off with the railroad to the east because they're still trying to connect to Halifax. Mm-hmm. So by 1876, the intercolonial to Halifax is built, and by this time his government's quite deeply into an economic depression, and he just says, like, we can't afford that original promise. There's just no two ways about it. The revenues, of course, are based on imports, and they had fallen off dramatically, and he has to go against the liberal belief of the day and raise the tariff. And then he sends George Brown to the States to negotiate a free trade deal with the States. And it looks like it's doing just great, going through everything. The Governor-General's unhappy because Canada's not supposed to negotiate with foreign powers by itself, but through the Governor-General. But nonetheless, it goes ahead, and then it gets held up on the American side, and so it's a dead letter. So his approach seems sensible, given that his economic policies were really constricted by international events or events outside his control. But eventually, not eventually, right away, just about, he gives the new outline for rail construction. It's to be an all-Canadian route by water from southern Ontario to Fort William, and then this complex of rail lakes and rivers to link to Lake Superior, and just says, like, it's absolutely out of the question that we'll have one line. And he's really no good at PR, you know, he doesn't know how to schmooze people. So it is very difficult, and of course, we saw how difficult it was for people to navigate their way to the west. Even to get to Winnipeg was really difficult, never mind going all the way to the west. So so he has a really hard time. There are thousands unemployed. Shipbuilders in Quebec are in trouble. The Maritimes are in trouble. There's strikes and labor violence in New Brunswick. I mean, just everything seems to be going wrong. And then his one great idea, which is this reciprocity treaty with the States, that falls apart as well. And government debt topped $134 million. Ooh, that's how much it cost for the alcohol trade in Canada. So you could have just cleared that out. out with everybody just not drinking their 4 gallons for a year. So interest payments took up 1/3 of all the government receipts. So something had to be done, but it's not going to be the Liberals that come up with the answer. So they're in till 1878, and as I said, you know, it's a worldwide depression. So it kicks off with an international panic, the collapse of the Vienna Stock Exchange in May of 1873, and there's there's railroad overbuilding, and their markets collapse in 1873 as well. And Bismarck in Germany abandons German free trade policy. France, I mean, it's just like it's almost like the Great Depression of the modern period. There's nothing that he can really do to help out. And of course, nobody wants to move during a worldwide depression. Nobody's got the money for it. So the idea of sending people out to the West, then not only is there not a train to take them out there, but you can't even get them into the country in the first place. And to save money, the Liberals even shut down the immigration offices overseas. So that would have reduced the number of people going, where was that Canadian place again? And then people heard how arduous the process was even when she got to Canada. And then later on, they would find out just how difficult it was to actually stake your claim. You know, somebody would give you some location markers and go, okay, off you go. And it could be like 50 or 100 miles from where you were, and there's no roads or anything. And you're like, oh my God, how do I even find the place that I've got? So, and so that's why, as I said, the big shock for, I suppose, the Liberals, but not for other people, was that people used the secret ballot to vote them out in 1878. And in the meantime, John A. Macdonald, in the wilderness years, John A. Macdonald declared himself to be the champion of national interests, and the Conservatives had believed in a low tariff policy, and they switched to a high tariff policy. And this is the economic strategy that bounces him back into power. And later on, he'll call these 3 things, the tariffs, the railway and settlement, or immigration, he'll call that the national policy. I think it's Charles Tupper that calls it the national policy for him. And so the 1878 election brings Macdonald back from the wilderness. He's supported in the electioneering leading up to the election. He's supported by the Canadian Manufacturers Association, a very powerful lobby group. And you know, commodities not produced in Canada could enter free of duty, but there's hefty protection for anything that we actually produced ourselves. And the downside was supposed to be that, you know, Joe Canadian had to pay more for goods, but the upside was that they'd be produced in Canada. And it's very interesting because there's a whole debate about the advocates of this free trade deal versus the anti-free trade deal people. And so the advocates are the Tories, and then the Liberals are against it, but then the Liberals had just been for it only a few years before and would be for it again around 1911-ish. And so it becomes, you know, it's framed the way it was in the NAFTA talks about, well, if you're for it, you're anti-Canadian, or, you know, you're not a real nationalist, and it just gets all involved with all sorts of other issues as well. But the most important thing is that once Macdonald's back in power, the one thing that he wants to do is to get his little railway going. He wants to get it going and get it finished this time. And so he's really keen to get stuck right in. Doesn't want to miss another chance. And of course, the people who are the people that are going to build the railway for him know that he wants the railway, and they know that, you know, he wants to get it completed pretty quickly. So in 1880, there's a consortium of Scottish-Canadian businessmen, oh yes, my type, from Montreal, headed by George Stephen, who's the president of the Bank of Montreal, and the Hudson Bay Company chief factor Donald A. Smith. They stepped forward, and they had both made their fortunes by this time speculating in American railroad building, so they're really good at that kind of stuff. And so they know that he's really keen to get this done, and they do kind of strike a hard bargain. And I'll just give you a list of what they demanded. So this is to build the railway across Canada. They wanted to be incorporated as a private company so that they would own the railroad. They wanted a government subsidy of $25 million. They wanted 25 million acres of arable land in alternating sections on a belt 40 kilometers wide on either side of the railway, all across the prairies. They wanted control of already completed government railways in Ontario and BC, and they wanted a promise that no federal lines would be run southeast of theirs to the States until the turn of the century, and all railway property had to be free in perpetuity, so you'd never have to pay for that. And they also they were given surface and mineral rights to the land that they picked, which becomes quite important later on. After, subsequent governments would pay a fee in lieu, so that the government wouldn't kind of reopen this. But just to give you an idea, the land that they get from this deal, when the government of Wilfrid Laurier, of Clifford Sifton is his Minister of the Interior, they want to open up the prairies big time to settlement, and so they say to the Hudson Bay Company, the Hudson Bay Company, which has some from before, and the CPR, you've got to sell that land because we want it settled, and it's the arable, it's the best land, and it nets them something like Stevens and Smith, it nets them something like $83 million when they sell their land, and the already completed government railways in Ontario and BC are valued at $30 million. So it's a sweet deal. It's a sweet deal. And so, you know, it looked like kind of highway robbery. And so there's a lot of debate in the House for about 2 months until the Conservative backbenchers are whipped into line by the party whip, and the bill for the CPR building becomes law. And the chief engineer, Sanford Fleming, who'd been in from the very, very start, he stayed on, but there were some immediate changes of plan because they were worried that land speculators, knowing what the route was, would try and buy up land, and then they'd have all the best bits. So they actually changed from that higher route through Portage la Prairie, Edmonton, Yellowhead. They changed from that and they built it in a more southerly direction. They were worried that if it was too high up, that people that wanted to get to the west would just simply go to the border and catch the American trains to the south and just take them, and then they'd have nobody. So they're like, well, if we build it closer to the border, they're more likely to take ours. And then the other argument is that the South, people in the South were staunch conservatives, and so when the vote would eventually, it's already there by that time, but when they get the vote there, they would vote, you know, as a body. But then the people in the North were Liberals, so you don't want to lose a whole area to the Liberals. So you know, it's just kind of interesting. So the American railroad specialist Cornelius Van Horne was brought in by the syndicate to oversee construction, and there's cost overruns quite quickly, and the syndicate's on the verge of bankruptcy by about 1883, and that's about the same time that it reaches Calgary. And they get a loan of $30 million from the government. Lots of grumbling. That's an awful lot of money. You know, they should have been able to do this. But then 1884, George Stevens back again, asking for more money. And Macdonald initially says, I don't think I can swing that at all. But one event, of course, is going to change his mind, and that's the Northwest Rebellion. When it looks like there's going to be trouble out west, what better way to be able to go into the House and say, we've got to have this money to finish the railway so that we can get troops out there if we need them. So the Northwest Rebellion, or the re-emergence of Louis Riel in what today we call Saskatchewan, is really important in that. So Parliament, they're not happy at first, but the CPR said that they would build a terminus in Quebec and in St. John, and that seemed to swing enough Quebec and New Brunswick MPs, because when you get a railway terminus, that's like, you know, say Central Station in Glasgow, that's the end spot. So you probably repair all the engines there as well. There's tons of secondary kind of offshoot jobs from it. So that was good. So Parliament voted to send troops to the Northwest and to finance the last leg of the rail construction. And the last spike, I know that you've been there, the last spike was hammered in at Craigellachie, right beside the enchanted forest of Revelstoke, BC. So Craigellachie on November 7th, 1885. And in the end, it cost the government about 25 million acres of land, because that's what they hand over, $63 million in public money and government loans of over $30 million. So it's an expensive national obsession.
Yes, indeed.
It certainly is. But that's,
much like alcohol.
Yeah.
The railroad and alcohol.
Yeah.
More common than you might think.
Oh, yeah, and you can't get in any trouble if you're a drunken train driver, because it's not like you can go off the tracks
That's
or
true.
anything. So you
Well,
just
you
can.
can.
You? Okay.
Well,
maybe
the train itself.
well, the
maybe.
train could go off, I suppose. Yeah, that's true. So that's all I'm going to tell you about
That's
Macdonald
I guess
era,
that
so
wraps up
that
our
does.
chat about the Macdonald era. And we'll have more next time on the History Hut.
We will indeed.